All right, this is Dr. Sheridan again. We're going to go into the next section of this lecture and finish this off and think about some of the themes about the actual war itself. So we're going to be doing some military history here and then a little bit of political and diplomatic history with the way that the United States is going to be brought into the war. So this slide is one of the wordiest. It's one of the most prolix, as they say, slides of the semester. So there's a lot of writing on this, but we're going to just try to go through each bullet point quickly and get through the material as easily as we can. The photograph here is an actual photograph on the very first day of World War II, of the Second World War in September 1st, 1939, with the German army, the German military, marching into neutral Poland, the invasion of Poland by Germany, which is the event which basically began World War II. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France, the British and French empires, immediately declared war on the German Empire, on the Third Reich, and this is going to eventually bring Italy into the war on the side of the Germans, forming the Axis powers. And so for the majority of World War II, there's going to be a series of two sides to the conflict. I think most of you know this, but just to reiterate it, one side, of course, is the Allies, which is first formed between Britain and France. And then eventually, as the war is going to go on, the Soviet Union, the former Russian nation state, the former Empire of Russia, is going to join also on the Allied side. So both during World War I and World War II, Russia, or the Soviet Union in the case of World War II, fought on the side of the Allies. And then eventually, of course, the United States joins in on the side of the Allies. You know, there's many parts of the former British Empire that also fought on the side of the Allies, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So the Allied powers had many different nation states supporting it, starting out, though, as Britain and France. And the Axis powers had originally Germany, and the states that it had taken over, like Austria and the other places, Czechoslovakia, that had been taken over by the Germans in the lead up to World War II. And then Italy is going to join in that alliance. And then eventually Japan, the Empire of Japan, is going to come in on the side of the Axis powers as well. So that's the sort of general military and diplomatic layout of the two sides of the belligerents during World War II. And at the beginning of the war, so remember, the United States is not in the war at the beginning. It's an almost entirely European affair at the beginning. And Germany just absolutely goes on the offensive, takes a series of actions for about 6 to 8 months where they just begin a series of very strong military engagements and victories. They did a couple right at the beginning in September. Then they waited for a period of time, and then we get to the spring of 1940, and that's when the German offensive really goes forward. And they utilized a new form of warfare that's known as blitzkrieg. You can see it here on the third bullet point down on the slide. It means lightning, sort of literally translated from the German to lightning war or lightning warfare. And it included a sort of triumvirate of modalities of military fighting, of the use of tanks, the use of air support, and then the use of troops on the ground. Sorry, my phone. And so there was this use of troops on the ground, this use of tanks, and quick movement by tanks, and then there was the use of the German Air Force, the German Luftwaffe. And that all comes together in this form of blitzkrieg. And it's very, very effective. Germany is able to win tremendous battles and tremendous engagements relatively quickly. And so Germany defeats, in this sort of 6 to 8 month period between September 1939 and June of 1940, it's like a 7, 8, 9 month period. They defeat Poland, they defeat Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and then eventually France. And they enter into France, and they do something that the German state was never able to do during World War I, which was to actually get to the capital of France, Paris, and capture it and make the people of Paris surrender to the German military and the German state. And so this attack is very successful. The Allies are scrambling. and it's very difficult for them to deal with it. Once France goes under in the last weeks of May and early June, it's just Britain fighting against Germany at this point, and Germany is eventually going to begin its attack on the British Isles, on the United Kingdom, through a series of aerial warfare, which becomes known as the Battle of Britain, which is going to last for several months, almost over a year period of time, conducted in the air. And remember the United Kingdom is a series of islands off the coast of Europe, very close to the mainland Europe, and this aerial attack takes place, starting really sort of in the summer of 1940 and going throughout the year into 1941. And Britain is eventually able to hold off the Germans. They are not invaded. They are not captured. They're not taken over by Germany. And Britain is just barely holding on, trying to fight back during these earlier series of years of the war. And very fragile, very vulnerable period for the Allies. France is under control by Germany. It's split into two. There's this part that's known as occupied France, which is the northern part of France, which was where Paris was. And then there was southern part of France, which became known as Vichy, Vichy, Vichy France, which was largely controlled by Germany, but was theoretically under the control of the French themselves and not, quote, occupied. And so, but in reality, Germany had control over all of France. And it's just a very perilous and difficult moment for the Allies fighting against the Axis powers during this part of 1940 and into 1941. Okay, so this last slide here on this PowerPoint, the U.S.'s reaction to the war. So theoretically, the U.S. wanted to stay out, as it says here on the first bullet point. The United States said they were neutral, that the U.S. was not going to actually get involved in the war. But of course, they were not really neutral. And there was a policy that was created almost at the very beginning of the war, about 3 weeks into the war, that became known as the cash and carry policy. The idea that if you would pay cash for a series of weapons, and if you agreed to carry them off on your own ships, then you would not have to, then you could actually benefit from military supplies coming from the United States. And so the selling of weapons, particularly to France and Britain at the beginning of the war, helped them to fight Germany, helped them to hold on, particularly Britain, once France capitulates. And this cash and carry, because prior to this point, it had been illegal for the United States to sell various types of war ammunition, military types of usage of technology to, I can't think of the word, sorry, but anyway, to use the various facilities of war and weaponry. It was illegal for the United States to do that when there were other belligerent states that were fighting in a war. And so this law that was passed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by FDR in 1939, in September of 1939, actually helped the Allies continue to fight, particularly, as I said, Britain, and it set the way for another series of policies, like the most famous of which is the Lend-Lease policy, where the United States actually lended and leased a series of ships and other types of naval operations to the British as well, to continue to fight before the United States actually get into the Second World War itself. So yes, the United States is theoretically neutral. Yes, the United States is theoretically out of the war. Yes, the isolationist position continues. But as you can see from the picture here, there's going to be a series of meetings that take place between the leaders of the United States. Of course, this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt sitting down here. Remember, Roosevelt was physically disabled and not able to stand on his own, which was something that the United States public did not really know. There were very few pictures ever taken of him in his wheelchair. And he carefully controlled that and manipulated that with the media. But he's sitting down here, of course, talking to Winston Churchill and Churchill's wife, Clementine Churchill. Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain, of the United Kingdom, starting in May of 1940, heading a coalition government of different political parties. And you might know Winston Churchill, since he's one of the most famous politicians in the world, in 20th century world history, and particularly in British history. And he was half American. His mother was an American heiress who had married into the very well-known Spencer Churchill family in England. And so he had a very close connection to this Anglo-American alliance, and he was doing all he could do to try to convince Roosevelt, very subtly in some ways and more directly in other ways. And he utilized his wife, he utilized a series of advisors, trying to get people who were close to Roosevelt to get the United States to at least theoretically support the war effort behind the scenes, and then eventually to bring the United States into World War II proper, completely. So Roosevelt runs, so all this is going on. Remember, Roosevelt had been elected in 1932. He had defeated Herbert Hoover when the Depression was going on that we talked about before. He runs for re-election as a Democrat in 1936 again. He wins election. And so then we come to the year of 1940. World War II is going on, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt decides for the very first time in United States history ever that he would run for a third term. He felt it was important. Roosevelt was a pretty strong leader, had some faults certainly, but he had a lot of confidence in himself. And he was willing to go against the tradition that dated all the way back to George Washington, where no U.S. president had ever agreed to run for a third term consecutively or a third term ever. And so Roosevelt decides to run. He defeats the Republican candidate Wendell Willkie and wins. And so this was the unprecedented moment in American history, political history, presidential history, executive branch history, where the sitting president ran and was elected to a third term. So he becomes the third straight Democratic president in 1940. And that leads us into 1941, and the U.S. is going to be brought into the war. They're going to be there's a series of things that are going to happen in 1941, but of course, the most famous of which is that the United States is going to be, bombed. A territory of the United States, not a state itself, because Hawaii, as you may remember, was not actually a state in the United States. It was just a territory in 1941. But of course, it was a place where the United States had economic and political interests and military interests, and had a very serious military base at Pearl Harbor and Honolulu. And of course, the Japanese Empire are going to decide eventually to attack on this very famous morning in December of 1941, and this attack at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by the Japanese Empire. And that is what eventually catalyzes and brings the United States into World War II, much to the relief of Churchill and the British government, much to the relief of the other allies, and really changes, of course, the dynamics of how World War II is going to be fought once another major power, particularly the United States, which was becoming one of the major superpowers at that particular moment, is coming into the war on the side of the Allies. So that brings the United States into the war. There's all sorts of discussions about, did the United States know the Pearl Harbor attack was going to happen? There's tons of discussion about all these issues about what brought the United States into the war, why it happened, how it happened. The word, again, remember is not history, but historiography, right? The historiography on World War II is immense. It is one of the most popular subjects, both for historians and for the public that just loves reading about World War II history. And so there's a lot of discussion by scholars about all these issues, and lots of complexity to it. But the United States eventually is brought into the war and comes into the war very quickly. And unlike World War I, where it took a period of time for the U.S. to mobilize itself and get ready to make an impact in World War I and the Great War, and to send the soldiers over, this is going to happen much more quickly in World War II. The U.S. is able to mobilize and to be fighting in various parts of the world, both in the Atlantic theater and then eventually in the Pacific theater, of course, because, of course, it was the Japanese in the Pacific theater that had attacked the United States. That leads the U.S. into this sort of two or three-pronged war effort in parts of Europe and parts of Africa and in parts of the Asian Pacific theater as well. All right, so we'll get into the ending of World War II, what happens on the home front and the domestic life in the United States on a variety of levels, and then eventually the sort of overall impact and wrapping up the themes of World War II in the next set of lectures. All right.